Lauren Kane is Chief Strategy Officer at Morressier. She is going to be talking, kind of extending on some of these topics, extending on some of these ideas on how our ecosystem has expanded and how we need to manage in order to support that. So Lauren, I see that you're still on mute.
Got it. Thanks, Todd. Hello, everyone. Just give me 1 second to share my screen. Okay,
And
look
we can see
okay?
your slides. Yep.
Okay, great. So good morning from Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to be here. And many thanks to Todd and Jill and the NISO team for having me as part of such an esteemed group. I really enjoyed that last session, so tough to follow that, but I will do my best. So my name is Lauren Kane, and I am the Chief Strategy and Publishing Officer for Morressier, which provides a platform for virtual conferences, conference content, and supporting workflows and services for the academic community. So while I work for a technology company, I am not a technologist by any stretch of the imagination. And so I want to set expectations from the beginning that my presentation is more geared to the strategic, business, and mission-based considerations surrounding managing change and accommodating new content types and new supporting systems within the scholarly communications ecosystem. And while my talk is more geared towards content producers and publishers, whether you are an institution, a society, or any sort of publishing organization, I think there are lessons, I hope, for all stakeholders, librarians and information managers as well, in thinking about the steps that your partners are taking to integrate this content and undergo these transformations, and what needs to happen in your own systems and processes to accommodate these changes. So I'll speak to three main topics today: making the case for new content types, key considerations for that all-important initial audit, and then best practices to ensure internal and external buy-in and sustainable success. I'm going to try to keep my presentation to about 15 to 20 minutes to encourage your questions and discussion. So please, as I'm droning on, please start to think about what we can discuss after the fact. So first, making the case. And this is the what and the why of my presentation. We're coming out of an insanely challenging 18 months. Resources are slim, teams are exhausted, and it's not the time to launch new products just because. It's not even the time to proliferate content unless there is a reason to do so. The research workflow is expanding, yes, but it's up to us, I think, to make sure it is enhancing the research process as well. And so when I talk about making the case, it's not just making the case to external stakeholders, it's really validating it ourselves as well. Is this worth our precious time? So today I'm focused here on a specific type of new content, and that is conference content. But I think the logic here and the validation process is extensible to other content types that are unaccounted for in traditional systems. So conference content is early stage research, which is also experimentation and engagement, sometimes long before a published article, or sometimes in the absence of the published work altogether. It is those early signals and steps of a research journey, and it's particularly critical to early career researchers that rely on conference presentations to disseminate their work and gather valuable feedback to move their research forward. So traditionally, pre-COVID, conferences, as we know, were mainly in person, physical events, where engagement was high, but access and inclusion was low. This is because these events were naturally limited to those that had the funding or the funds to attend in person, and digital access to the content presented at the conferences was largely unavailable. On the flip side, virtual conferences, even many held during the past 18 months, were much more accessible and inclusive, but could suffer from lower engagement. Although I do think we can all agree that has improved over these past 18 months with new tools and strategies for networking in virtual environments. But we are humans looking for in-person connection, and I think our ideal future state will be the best of both of those formats, whether we want to call that hybrid or not, that combines the engagement of in-person with the accessibility of virtual dissemination. But when we're thinking about the content that is produced, these events, whether virtual or in person or hybrid, are still just containers. And as David Rose said, it's the wine, not the label. And in scholarly communications, for me, it's the content, not the container. And so we should be asking ourselves, irrespective of the container, are we doing right by the content that is being produced at these very important events that are such a critical part of the scholarly ecosystem? So conference proceedings are the perfect example of something that's been done one way for a very long time, where format and delivery do not match their intended use, their reason for existence. So this is a very helpful summary from Beth Tomset-Scott from the Penn State University Library site, explaining to students and patrons what proceedings are and why they should be used. Put simply, they are a published record of a conference, typically including abstracts or reports of presented papers, typical being the operative word. And the reasons to use or to engage with this research, to present new ideas and to connect with the authors and teams of this work, whether you were at the conference, but especially if you were not. Now, in the before times, as we said, most conference content, posters, presentations, technical demos, engagement with the content itself, including things like Q&As, was all limited to the physical conference, with some exceptions, of course, for some forward-looking organizations who brought some of this content online. But for most, the record of a conference, if it existed at all, was limited to meeting abstracts and traditional text-based conference proceedings. Now, in 2020 and much of 2021, this obviously changed with all conferences happening online and stakeholders having the experience of making this content digitally available and for some preserved as part of their educational offerings for the first time. So the question becomes, what happens next? Do we revert? Do we stay this new course? Do we do something different? Hybrid meetings are a whole other presentation, so I won't get into that here, but what happens with the content? Well, what I hope happens is a blurring of lines between the physical and digital experiences and a rethinking of what conference proceedings are or should be. Thinking back to the PSU library slide of what proceedings are meant for, engaging, a full presentation of research, a way to connect. Which of these better supports the research process? Is it a solely text-based record of a conference? Or is it a package of posters and presentations and videos and abstracts and data sets and negative results? Which is more inclusive of feeling like you are at an actual event, of engaging with the content and with the authors more fully? Conference content, early stage research, all contribute to a richer, more comprehensive research experience that provides greater transparency, accessibility, and engagement. The research workflow is a journey that informs findings and breakthroughs in the future, and the early part of that journey has value in communicating what worked and what didn't work. In science, as I think in life, it's critical that we learn from the past, that we consider it a prologue in order to move forward. So now that we've covered the what and the why, and you're completely sold on this, let's move to the how. So here is a beautiful old Victorian home. Beautiful property, solid architecture, wonderful history. Been a lovely home for its inhabitants. There are some issues though. There's no central air. The paint needs to be touched up. There's only one entrance. And the people who live there have a growing family and want to welcome more friends to the house. So what should they do? Does anyone think they should burn the house down? Of course not. There is far more good to preserve, and the challenge is to accommodate new needs and more users without starting from scratch. And so I know that's a completely groan-worthy example, but I do think the hyperbole is important because this is, of course, the same challenge facing scholarly communications organizations at this point in time. How do we leverage existing systems and existing infrastructure and an overall extremely solid foundation, and yet accommodate the new user needs, new requirements, expanding content and research workflows. We don't need to burn the house down or reinvent. Reinvention is something that I think is completely overused as a term. We do need to rethink. We do need to renovate. But part of why I emphasize this is because I think there is a lot of fear among groups who feel like we can't possibly do more, especially coming out of COVID in the past 18 months. But change can be incremental, and even small improvements can have lasting effects. So there is no one size fits all. And so what is needed, as with any digital transformation project, is first a solid audit of current state. So this section is key considerations, which is by no means exhaustive. It aims to be very practical at the types of questions that organizations of all sizes should ask themselves to take stock of what they have, what they need, and where they want to go, whether that is for a full-on transformation project or whether it's an incremental change or a bridge project to the future. So first, what content do you have? Or more specifically, what content do you have that is undigitized or inaccessible or unlinked to other content offerings? When looking at conference content, this might be posters, meeting abstracts, presentations, technical demos, video data sets, but it could be any number of other educational assets that are not being leveraged at present. A major consideration, and one that should be surfaced very early on, and unfortunately sometimes is not, is what rights do you have to this content? In the case of conference content, were rights assigned to the speaker's affiliated organization, to the conference, to the society, to the institution. Obviously, before you package and monetize anything, even on an open access basis, you need to be cognizant of this, especially because when we're talking about video, video presents a more compelling reason for many for takedown notices that may be typical. There may also be a difference in the content and the rights you have in the past and what you'll have going forward because practices are changing. For instance, many groups have started to include speaker release forms in their workflows and are capturing digital content from their events, even if they don't have a product or a use case identified yet. But they're savvily thinking about keeping their options open for the future, which I highly recommend. So for any group that is hosting a virtual meeting or returning to on-site even and having an AV component, I'd encourage you to think before about what is worth digitizing and preserving and ensuring that any agreements you sign with any vendors gives you the rights to this transformed content for your own use. Again, whether it is for immediate use or whether you just want the security of having this down the road. Many organizations, of course, have a platform partner or press or commercial publisher for their primary publishing relationship for journals or books or other educational products. Some have multiple. Obviously, this relationship then needs to be kept in mind when thinking about new content types and new products and the systems that support them. Do you want to work with your primary partner for all of your content? Is there value in introducing a new partner? And if so, how accommodating will your other vendor be to this? Can they offer, for instance, federated search and linking? Or if you have your own platform and infrastructure, how can you accommodate new content directly? What are the relative benefits and drawbacks of both approaches? What is the financial impact of these scenarios? Again, these may seem like very obvious questions, but you'd be surprised about how many people don't think about these things until they're well on their way of a plan. And to doing it very early on in the process is just so important. And as an extension of the previous question, will your new content library be a standalone repository, or will it be fully integrated with other primary content? I've worked with groups that see the value in both. Standalone can allow for the communication that this is a different type of content with a use that's unique from, say, peer-reviewed articles, similar to a preprint server. For others, it's important to have things like posters and presentations treated as supplementary data and thus displayed alongside articles. In either case, linking and search are critical, since part of the point of this endeavor is to meaningfully link together this content within the research journey and not just treat it as an ephemeral other. So even if it is going to be a separate installation and not integrated, it does need to be interlinked, or it should be interlinked. The definitive question of our time, open or closed? Again, groups are successfully doing both. I personally think conference content is ideal for open access because the content types, for instance, if applying a submission or publication fee to things like posters and presentations, you can do a micro APC of say $50 to $100, making it a much lower barrier to entry for submitters than a typical journal article that might cost $2,000 for an APC. But it's also something that can scale for publishers and content producers. And of course, when talking about accessibility and inclusivity, an open model for conference content or new content types in general does achieve that aim more readily. But it is organization specific, and there are plenty that are successfully and sustainably wrapping new content types into an existing subscription or as an add-on to their subscriber base. But either way, understanding your model, your rationale for that model is a critical starting point for your early audit. And further to open or closed, who will pay? And I don't just mean who is the payer, whether the author or the subscriber, a funder, but I mean who will see the value in this enough to pay. We know publishing is not free and someone has to pay. And for it to be sustainable over the long term and worth the effort of the digital transformation projects that we're talking about, someone needs to be reasonably committed to paying over the long term. So if your model is for authors as payers, many of them early career researchers, to pay to present their work, make sure to test this assumption with that community about what benefits they will need to see to make this worthwhile to them. And the same, of course, is true on the subscriber side. If you'll be selling, say, a video library of technical demonstrations to corporations, make sure beforehand that you've done your homework about a compelling price point and the requirements that they may have about access or security or usage. And lastly, do not underestimate the need for resources, financial, but especially human. Any project, however small, requires resources, and you'll have a better outcome if you are aligned internally from the onset about what the investment will be, as well as what the return on that investment will be. So I've thrown a lot of questions at you, which may be a little bit overwhelming if you're thinking about projects of this type, but I want to leave you with some best practices, things that are true no matter the scope or organization size or project budget. And these are best practices, again, that are extensible beyond conference content, I think, to any sort of digital transformation project. Sounds obvious, but this can be the single biggest barrier. It's amazing how many organizations dive head into the execution of an idea, especially when there's excitement involved or they want to be a first mover, before they've established a plan, or even before a plan, baseline requirements, limitations, or even goals. So as I've said throughout this presentation, an initial audit is so important, and it does not have to be something that's exhaustive. It's wonderful if you have a consulting partner, but you don't need to. This is something that you can do internally. Just really give a lot of thought to bringing the right people to the table and making sure that you have the requirements and a good plan in place. And so further to that, also seemingly obvious, get stakeholder buy-in. And that means internally too. Projects with conference content especially can be challenging because they bring together the meetings and the publications departments, two groups that historically haven't had too much interface at many organizations. This is, of course, a great opportunity to become more aligned and to work collaboratively together on a project. But those that succeed establish buy-in from the very beginning about why this project is important to both departments and to the organization as a whole, and why it is meaningful from the outset. And you can absolutely start small. There are so many things happening in parallel right now at all of your organizations. So you might just start with something like digitizing posters, or with making sure that keynotes are recorded, or with integrating a certain amount of video into your proceedings. But also don't close yourself off to future possibilities. as we said earlier, be aware of your rights, the agreements you sign, and when possible, digitize and preserve everything you can. So if you do end up with a new product or new library approach down the road, you have the content ready to include. You don't want to be saying in 2 years' time, if only we had recorded those presentations or saved those files from 2021. Now, I'm totally pandering to my host here with the last 2 slides, but I do mean it too. Just because this is a new type of content, it should be treated with the same respect and with all the benefits of our existing systems and scholarly communications infrastructure. Posters should have DOIs. Presentations should have clean metadata, including relevant funding information. For this content to have a meaningful place in our ecosystem, it needs to be integrated. And for it to be integrated, it needs to share the same markers and metadata as other content types. But much of the standards around these new content types, including video, are still emerging. NISO has a working group on just this topic. So collaborating and contributing to these standards and the conversation around this content is critical. And sorry, I'm losing my AirPods, and raises all boats in a healthier and more communicative ecosystem. So share what you're working on. Ask questions when you're facing a decision point. Let's make sure that collectively we are building and enhancing the research process in a sustainable and more useful way. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate everyone listening, and hope there are questions and comments.
Thank you, Lauren. And I appreciate pandering. I really do.
That was for you, Todd. Yeah.
Metadata is so important. So I appreciate you highlighting that fact and highlighting the work that NISO has ongoing in this regard. Question that I have for you, as you are working in a company that is developing, not exactly early stage, you're kind of beyond the startup, but still in your kind of early stages. Reflecting on your own organization, one of the things you said is like, if only we had ... And thinking about what Steph and John were talking about earlier, are there things that upon reflection you wish you had done in this stage? Maybe things that you discarded earlier that you might want to have had or kept, and not necessarily what are they, but how do you think about that moving forward? How does that adjust your planning moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly, and we still are very much a startup. That's fine. I'll wear that badge with honor. Or as any company, there are things that we wish we did differently, or strategically things that we would have shifted. But when I was talking a bit about, it's something that I think I see across many of the groups that we work with, and that's whether it's societies or institutions or corporations, and big and small, is this feeling, which is I think natural, that especially during the last 18 months when everything was happening so rapidly and people were really just trying to keep the lights on and do all the things, the show must go on. But that now, as the dust settles and saying, okay, what do we want to do in terms of new product development, or we need a new revenue source, or we want to, get this information out there, that it can be, as you said, oh, but we didn't record, we had the virtual meeting, we were halfway there. But perhaps it wasn't recorded, or perhaps we didn't have the rights, to that content to leverage it, or we didn't really kind of think this through. And again, there are very good reasons why that didn't happen in the years of 2020 and 2021. But I think it's a good lesson, for everyone to think about that. Let's all take a beat, and before we get into the next phase of what do we want to do, and make sure we've done our homework, we have that information, and we're ready to go. Because as you point out, hindsight for every organization can be 2020, and so making sure that you really take have that kind of strategic understanding before you're going in. It's just going to save you so many headaches down the road.
Yeah, and I appreciate the fact that you raised the issue of rights, and I'm wondering to what extent you've experienced this. And again, I know you're not a lawyer. Um, don't no one take this as legal advice. But I'm wondering the rights that I would get. So, say I'm getting uh, images, Adobe stock images for my presentations, and I get the rights for a presentation. Have you heard anything about people getting dinged for or complaints about, well, it's a video of my presentation and you're posting a video
Mhm.
online? Have you heard anything along those lines as like that's a problem?
That's so interesting. I mean, I have not heard of anyone actually getting dinged for that, but I definitely heard of people that are worried about that, that are going back and, from the author perspective of making sure that they're, just being fully cognizant of saying, I want to re-upload my presentation because I had an image or something that I probably shouldn't have used. And it's one thing and this is one of the things between in person and digital, right? In person, I might give a presentation where I'm not really worried about, and again, not a lawyer, don't quote me, but I'm less worried about perhaps using things that I might not have the rights to if I'm just doing it in person to 40 people. Whereas if you are doing this both online, it's going to be preserved. It's also going to be part of a package that's sold. I think people then become a little bit more careful. I know I am, even in my own presentations, even for something like today, making sure I'm using images and things that I have the rights to do, because I think we're understanding that content itself has a longer half-life. And so that with that comes a certain amount of legal risk.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. Again, it's sort of as with technical debt, there are all of these related elements that we need to start thinking about um, as we're exploring new content forms, as we're exploring new approaches. Um, you know, we always have to deal with more lawyers somewhere.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Todd. I just wanted to, I'll keep us on time, but I really appreciate being here. And I